Sorry. Uh, Good afternoon and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our special event, Sustainability in Practice, the Road to Net Zero, organized by Národná banka Slovenska, International Sustainable Finance Center, and the British Embassy. Today, we delve into crucial discussion shaping our approach to achieving sustainable and net zero future. We are honored to have such a distinguished guests with us and speakers to share their expertise and insights on how to transition the economy and business to net zero model by 2050. Let's engage in productive dialogues to foster innovation and collaboration in our journey towards sustainable in line of insightful discussion. We close the day with an evening reception at the foyer. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to introduce Mr. Rainer Martin, Executive Director of the Národná banka, to deliver his welcome remarks. Rainer, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roman, and dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear speakers. I'm very, very happy to welcome you here, and let me also thank, following up on Roman, the co-organizers of this event, the ESFC in Prague. It's been great cooperating with you all the time, again, and the Embassy of the United Kingdom. So we have a very busy agenda for the next around about 2 hours, so I will be very brief, but I would like to set the scene, so to say. And let me start with some bad news and some at least moderately good news. So the bad news actually came just a few days ago when the European Environmental Agency published their latest climate risk assessment. And what do they find? Well, the EEA finds that last year, globally, we have already more than 1.5 degrees above our long-term average temperature on record. So if you remember, this was the original goal of the Paris Agreement, so we're there. You missed it. And what's more is that Europe will warm up at twice that rate based on all the available scenarios. So that's a lot more than other parts. What does that mean? I think the message is very clear. We need to do more, and we need to be faster to become carbon neutral and to stop the spread. And we need to do more to deal with the impact of climate change, so basically the adaptation costs. Better now? Okay, better? Very good. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Right, so both of these things, transitioning to carbon neutral and dealing with the impact of climate change requires, of course, investments, and in fact a lot of investments. And this brings us to the topic of today's workshop. And here comes some, at least moderately, good news. The first one is, although it's very, very difficult to assess with any degree of precision how much investment we actually need, there has been quite a lot of work going into this already. And the quantitative estimates, they differ quite a lot between the people who do them, the organizations to do them. But what they have in common is that they all suggest that this challenge, the need for investment, is a lot, but it's not, but we're never really talking about insurmountable challenges or some that are absolutely impossible or unrealistic. So this investment can be managed. So just to put it a little bit into perspective, the European Commission, this is 2 years ago now, they looked at the energy investment needs, and they came up with a figure of around 2% of GDP for the European Union as a whole. Probably less for Slovakia, given the more advantageous energy mix that we have here. But again, 2%, this is not something that is insurmountable. So just to put it into another context, last year alone, the European Union spend around 1 trillion on energy imports and on energy subsidies. This is around 5% of GDP. So clearly some adjustment here should be feasible. Now, of course, investments in energy, this is not all, this is just part of the picture. So there are also substantial investment needs in other sectors to enable the transition, and I think this must not be forgotten, this is absolutely important, to have social expenditures that are needed to soften the adjustment costs that this transition will have for many people. So looking at all of this together, the French very well-known economist Jean Pisani-Ferry recently compared the transition to the oil price shocks that we experienced in the early 1970s. But the difference this time is that we can prepare much earlier and much better. So it should be much easier to absorb this problem. And here comes the second positive aspect. Well, most of these investments are, of course, not dead weight losses. This is not something that you put into the sand and then it's there. Properly done, these investments will yield return. And in fact, they may even help Europe to overcome its long-standing productivity problem. So in any case, a large share of these investments should be suitable for commercial financing, even though we just had a practical session before, and there are a lot of people said there is a lack of good projects, so a lot of work needs to be done to change this. But this certainly, this commercial financeability widens the range of options that we have. So there is the bank financing. This is the mainstay, of course, of the financial sector in the EU. There is non-bank financing, and on this we need a lot more. So Madame Lagarde recently said we need a green capital markets union. I think she's right. I mean, we need to do more on that. And then, of course, there are the public banks. So, for example, the European Investment Bank is also represented here today, which is the biggest public bank in the world. So there is a rather sizable asset that we have at our disposal. There are other national and international development banks. And last but not least, there are, of course, the governments, which have to play an important role in facilitating risk sharing and dealing with the social issues associated with the green transition. A very last point, and then I pass over to our keynote speaker. For us at Národná banka Slovenska, this is a crucial topic. This is why also we are organizing these sort of events. We need to understand the impact of climate change and the green transition in order to assess economic and price developments, in order to assess financial developments and financial stability. And as a public institution, of course, we have a keen interest to make sure that the transition to zero carbon is as smooth and as efficient as possible. So we hope that events like the one today, where leading experts in the field come together and share and spread their knowledge, will help to make this as smooth as possible. Thank you very much for your attention, and I pass over to our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Rainer, thank you very much for welcome remarks. We will continue with the keynote speech, and please let me introduce Mr. Elena Fiestas, sorry, Chair of the EU Platform and on Sustainable Finance and Commissioner, Spanish Finance Authority. The stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honor to be here with all of you today in Bratislava, and I would like to especially thank the National Bank of Slovakia for the invitation and International Sustainable Finance Center. Now, the honor is all mine because I am sorry to inform you, but I am here to talk about regulation. So apologies in advance. It's been in 8 days, exactly 8 days, it will be the 6th anniversary of the launch of the Roadmap on Sustainable Finance, the European Roadmap on Sustainable Finance. And I've been involved in the development of the roadmap since the very beginning, since exactly June 2018. And I think it is really important to take one step back and see, well, what does it mean? I mean, what was that roadmap? You know, what was the intention of the roadmap? And where are we today, 6 years later? The first thing I would like to share with all of you is that the roadmap, it responded, or it actually reflected an entire strategy that in turn aimed to be a response to the realization from the European authorities that there was no way that Europe will achieve the net zero goals by 2050, that there will be no transition unless, we can count on the financial sector. And the goals of, call it roadmap, or the sustainable finance framework were threefold. The first one was to narrow the investment gap. You have heard it over and over that in Europe there's an investment gap of around 620 billion annually of additional investments in order to meet our 2030 goals. So the Sustainable Finance Framework aims to encourage private sector and investment to move capital from less sustainable assets to sustainable assets and narrow that gap. So basically to invest in the products, services, and technologies that will help the economy and society to transition. The second one was that, of course, we are in a capitalist, economy, and we know that we need to change the economic model. For that, the core of the model is the finance sector. So we were hoping for the finance sector to take the leadership, to be the engine of the economy, and to accompany companies, but also other stakeholders in their transition. And the third one, it was the transition of the financial sector itself. On one hand, in order to manage the risks, we're talking about transition risks. So for transition risk, we're talking about decarbonizing credit and investment portfolios, but also equally to manage the physical risks. And that basically means to build up the resilience of those credits and investment portfolios. In the next few minutes, I wanted to share with you a little bit, an overview, explain you what I call this jigsaw, a big puzzle that we call the Sustainable Finance Framework, how it works. But instead of going one by one regulation, I want to share it with you through an example, share with you the understanding, what was the thinking behind, through an example that I made up, of course. And secondly, I will give you a little bit of a first evaluation of the sustainable finance, what we're seeing on the ground. So let me start with, let's go first to disentangle and understand better that jigsaw, right? At the centerpiece of the jigsaw, we have the EU taxonomy. I admit that it's not the sexiest name, taxonomy, and taxonomy just means scientific classification. What the taxonomy is, it's a little bit like a dictionary. It tells you which economic activities can be considered sustainable under which circumstances. And for that sets criteria, wherever possible, quantitative, and then, in order for an economic activity to be part of the taxonomy, it needs to meet the criteria. So the taxonomy, as I said, this dictionary would allow all of us to speak the same language when we talk about green or sustainable finance. I mean, until very recently, we were living in a very sort of a normal situation where not only everyone could define what was green, but also that they define how green they were, right? So the taxonomy aims to put a little bit of order, a little bit like the recommended daily intakes of food, yeah? So if you market your product, your yogurt, for example, or whatever food product as low fat, the minimum to ask is to ask how much fat it's got. And because the majority of us, we don't know whether 25 grams is too much fat or too less fat, we need the official, benchmark. So think about the taxonomy as that official benchmark that would allow you to measure the degree of sustainability, yeah? But interesting enough, the taxonomy, the dictionary, doesn't play or act in isolation, yeah? There are other pieces around it, yeah? And one of the pieces is the piece that says the companies need to report the percentage of revenues that generated from the activities that meets the criteria. So that gives us what we call the revenues alignment KPI, which tell us where a company is today. What is, the level of sustainability of a company today. But it also, very interestingly, and for the very first time, and anyone that knows me, they know how much in love I am with CapEx. They also, I am very much in love with CapEx, but also tell us that you need to report how much of your capital expenditures, are aligned with the taxonomy. And that's really interesting because it's starting to give us a picture of the direction of travel of the company. And by doing so, the taxonomy goes from being a dictionary to being a little bit like the metric system of the 21st century. Yeah? It tells us the percentage, right, of sustainability of a company's activities and of investments. Equally, financial markets, now we move to another piece of the puzzle. Financial market participants need to start saying what is the percentage of the funds that is aligned with the taxonomy through revenues and CapEx, yeah? So that way, and that is mandatory for those that either have an environmental objective or they have environmental characteristics, ESG characteristics. So we go back to the yogurt, yeah, the low-fat example. So if you're promoting your product as low-fat, you need to tell us how much fat it's got and how that relates with the official definition of low-fat. So let's go to an example. It's almost like a real-life example. So imagine I'm the CEO of a utility company, yeah, and I have 4 plants. Let's make it simple, yeah. 4 power generation plants, and each one of them generates 25% of my revenues. And I know, very much concerned about the competitiveness of my company. I know that I need to, there's a really high carbon price. I know about the EU policies moving forward. I know that my future depends on how fast I'm going to be able to adapt to that new environment and actually become sustainable. So the first thing I do is, okay, I'm going to start developing my transition plan to net zero. And I want to achieve that by 2040 before 2050, so I have that first mover approach. So the first thing I do is take the taxonomy, and I go to each one of my plants, and I see, does my plant meet the criteria? To cut a long story short, it's 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilo of water. So I go with the first one. Nice, tick the box. I meet the criteria, 25% of my revenues already. But then I look at the second, the third, and fourth, and they don't. So what do I do next? Then I think, okay, if I want to achieve it by 2040, then I'm going to start with renovating, transforming my second plant, and I'm going to develop a CapEx plan, an investment plan to do so. I know it's going to cost me, X million, and that would be around 50% of my annual CapEx, and I'm going to do that during the next 4 years, so by 2025, I meet the criteria, and I become 50% revenue alignment. And then I go, okay, for the third and the fourth, I'm going to do it for 2035, and then finally 2040. So I'll set those targets. I also know that not only I need to reduce and reach my emissions and reach net zero, but I also need to adapt, right? I need to ensure that they are resilient. So I take the taxonomy again. This time I look at the adaptation taxonomy, and I go like, okay, first step, I need to conduct a risk evaluation, right? A risk assessment on the physical risks of my plants. Then, I command that. They come along, they do the risk assessment, and they find out that everything is fine except for my fourth plant, which is in a flood, in a risk flooding area. Then I know that I need to invest. I need to invest in the measures that the consultants have proposed in order to eliminate the risk. And that's going to cost, let's imagine, 25% of my CapEx over the next couple of years. So that means that I am 25% revenue aligned, and then I'm 75% CapEx aligned, because every year for the next 3 years I'm going to invest 75%, and then the next 2 years, 50%. You do the math, right? So why is that so interesting for me? Yeah? Well, it's very interesting because now I can go to the bank. So let's imagine, instead of EIB, it's a private bank, and I go to the bank and I say, hello, I need this funding. I would like to maybe issue a green bond. I heard there's quite a lot of appetite in the market for that, or maybe a series of green loans that I know the bank might be interested to also give in order they can then, securize, make a structured product, and sell it to investors. If I am a listed company, I also know that from now on, all my equity, my shares, and my general purpose bonds have two figures attached to them. On one hand, the 25%, on the other hand, the 75%. Now, anyone who has worked in the green fund, world, will know that green funds until very recently were monopolized by revenues, yeah? Everything was about the percentage of revenue. So in a way, a little bit backward looking, yeah? Now, what we have is we have incorporated CapEx. So I can have and construct my transition funds based on the CapEx and how it fits to a transition fund. And for those to be Article 9, for the geeks that know SFDR, then they can be classified as an Article 9 and have a transition fund. Now, I know as a company that there's a huge appetite for that because today the European market, 56% of all the assets under management in Europe in the capital markets are ESG. In a way, they're low fat, right? So all those low fat, 56%, have to report against the taxonomy. So now you start seeing a little bit what the idea behind it is, right? The idea is that you build the demand, you really foster the demand, but at the same time, you are creating the supply because all those companies, all those investments that they need to do, that's the supply, and that's how it works. Now, where are we today? I already mentioned about the 56%. It's interesting because today, what can we really evaluate? What we can evaluate is the impact mainly in the large companies, because only the large publicly traded companies have started reporting against the taxonomy. And that only on climate, without even the climate taxonomy being totally finished. But let's look at the numbers. So where we have of the 1,400 largest companies in Europe, publicly traded, the percentage of alignment in revenue base is 23% for those that is greater than 0%, and 9% if we take all of them. When it comes to CapEx, we go to 24 and 12%. Now, the even more interesting thing is that when you start looking sector by sector, you realize that the high impact sectors, interesting enough, have the largest percentage of CapEx alignment, being the utilities, 69%, then followed by real estate and then the industrial sectors. But when you look company by company, you start looking on the high impact sectors, what you realize is that the green CapEx is much significantly greater than the green CapEx. Basically, what it means in taxonomy terminology in our world is that they're investing to become taxonomy aligning. So they are investing, like the company I put the example of, who is transforming the second plant. So basically, that they are actually investing in transition, that's transition finance. And that's the beauty of the sustainable finance framework, because at the very, very core, what it aims is to facilitate the access to finance to corporates in order to finance their transition. Even more interesting, when we looked at 1,700 of the largest companies, 600 of them already set targets based on taxonomy, like the example I was giving you for the third and the fourth of the plans. Now, if we start moving away a little bit from the taxonomy, with one of the caveats that this year we'll have the reporting for all the environmental objectives, and that, if we take MSCI for all countries, yeah, the world index, that is going to go up to 74% of the index have more than 10% eligibility. That means that 3/4 of the market, will be able to be, at a certain level of percentage alignment with the taxonomy. If we move away from the taxonomy, and for those who have been following, for example, the climate transition benchmarks and the Paris-aligned benchmark, today we have raised 120 billion of euros on funds that they track one of the indices. Now, in terms of green bonds, 8.5% of of all the bonds issued by European companies are actually green bonds. And we can go on and on with some of the figures, but as said, what we can today really evaluate is what affects the largest companies, and some of the tools like the climate transition benchmarks we have been in the market for a couple of years. Now, does this mean that, everything that I just shared, that the sustainable finance framework is working on the ground wonderfully, has no problems, is going to sort out all our problems? Not at all. What I'm saying is that, and this is probably my biggest message, is that don't throw the baby with the bathwater. The framework is working, on the ground, but we're also aware of all the challenges and how much we need to now polish, the different pieces of the jigsaw in order to really maximize its potential. We also know that the sustainable finance framework has been made or developed or designed mainly to look at capital markets, and the largest companies. And now we need to start adjusting it, and adapting it for different markets, for different, what I call cases, from SMEs to developing investments in developing countries, public sector, and that's a lot of work, that it has been undertaken, that the platform is conducting, and I'll be more than happy to share with you what we're doing in a minute. But what I want to say more than anything is that we need to take into account that although it was thought as one piece, one jigsaw, the different pieces of the jigsaw were being developed and negotiated separately, which means that now that we're putting it back together, sometimes they don't quite fit, right? So now we need to polish them. And that's the work that the Commission and the platform is doing right now. We need to look at the consistency. We need to look at and we've been looking at consistency for over a year. We need to look at simplifying it, avoid duplicities, see what works, but also start learning from the implementation. This is new territory. This is like the new frontier, we're in an explored territory. So now we see what works, what doesn't work, and we need to fit it in and start making it work. And I will finish by saying that in that special cases that I was thinking about, and that it is really important for all the different stakeholders and the different regions in Europe to engage with the European Commission, with the platform, and to bring their cases, their realities. So today, I want to finish today by saying, please engage with us. We need to hear from you. What are the challenges in Slovakia? What works, what it doesn't, what we miss, and the extent to which, different pieces of the jigsaw might need to be adapted, in order to work for your market. Because at the end of the day, what it is at stake is the future of Europe, and we need to reach that net zero by 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring keynote speech. This didn't sound like regulation at all. So I'm happy that you stay with us a bit longer. And now let me introduce the host of our next on-stage interview, with focuses on a CSRD and implementation of the EU Sustainable Finance Agenda, Adina Manuela Relikowski. Principal Advisor of Sustainable Finance at the European Investment Bank, will lead this interview.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. So, before moving after this inspiring speech and demystifying speech of the EU sustainable finance framework, I would like to. Elena, you already know, she was here giving the keynote speech. Let's introduce first of all Ota, and then we move into the real discussion. So Ota, please just introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for the floor. I hope you can hear me. My name is Ota Melcher, and I'm currently working at the Czech Ministry of Finance, where I'm leading the newly established department on sustainability policies. It's a new initiative from the side of the Ministry of Finance. We started from the 1st of January this year, and our efforts, they break down into two pillars. We have one pillar that's dealing with the sustainable finance framework that Helena just excellently introduced, and the other one is focused on sustainability analysis. So that means looking at the impacts of decarbonization on different sectors of economy, on households, and so on. So that's my short introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to start by building on the key message that Elena sent. So the EU Sustainable Finance Framework, it's working on the ground, but there are challenges. So what do we do to overcome these challenges? So first of all, I would like to listen to Ota, because he is very close to the local governments, which are the challenges for the local governments, and then also to listen how the EU Sustainable Finance Platform can help to overcome these challenges and particularly to support the market participants. So still working on the ground, but with challenges.
Great, thanks. Nice set of questions. Let me just firstly say that I really appreciate the invitation for this conference, and I also like to thank the National Bank of Slovakia for the invitation, and also the International Sustainable Finance Center. It's very helpful in loads of initiatives in this area. And I also would like to thank Helena for not a speech. I thought this was a really nice lecture on the sustainable finance agenda. So a couple of words on the challenges. I think what we're trying to do is to change a little bit the narrative on what's coming to the national governments from the side of the European Commission, and trying to change the perception of this as a kind of threat and a challenge into more opportunity, how we can face and address the environmental and social challenges in our countries, and how we can actually boost economic prosperity and support the competitiveness in the medium to long term, because short term there are definitely issues with the competitiveness of some of the sectors of the European economy. So first, I would like to start with saying a couple of words on the kind of regulatory framework. I think that one of the key challenges standing before the governments is to ensure that there's a robust regulatory framework that would first incentivize sustainable finance and also mobilize the private capital, because I think there's a common understanding that vast majority of the funds that we need to fill the investment gaps that you were talking about, Helena, need to come from the private sector. So we need to make sure that the robust regulatory framework is on the ground to encourage green investment but also at the same time maintain the competitiveness of the financial market. In the Czech Republic, we're looking at the value for money of every crown that we use. And therefore, we are trying to assess the current subsidy schemes and turn them more into financial instrument schemes, and look at de-risking investment and similar issues. We try also to change the perception on the current regulatory framework, which sometimes can incentivize to rather short-term gains than looking more on the investment. And sustainable finance is really looking at the whole life cycle of investment, looking not only at the upfront costs that could be higher than for conventional investment because you're building in a lot of additional elements, but also looking at the performance of the investment through the life cycle where you can see considerable savings and less maintenance, for example, costs. Second issue is data. We understand this, or at least I'm trying to present this as a data-driven process. It's an evidence-based process, and we don't call it sustainability only, but we call it for the first, it's sustainability 2.0. It's measured sustainability. That's why we're having all this, all these encyclopedia taxonomy where you can read in your bed. It's very inspiring about all these, about the principles of sustainability or the sustainability standards for different sectors, for different economic activities. And that, therefore, we really need to have accurate and standardized data and be able to put together these data in one place so it's accessible for all the players, all the stakeholders. It's one of these issues we are confronted with from the side of from the private sector, that the data most often they are somewhere that they are existing, but they are not harmonized, they are not accessible, they are not interoperable, and so on. So we need to invest time and resources into data infrastructure and promote standardization. Third issue is coordination and collaboration, and from my role at the ministry, I feel this is a key element. The sustainable finance agenda, it's a part of even a bigger piece of not regulatory work, but more like harmonization of the conditions on the European market. And it's a complex issue. Helena has walked you through it, but it's not superficial. But I mean, it goes really into a depth and some of its dimensions. And if you start reading the delegated acts of taxonomy, all the ways how you should approach ESRS reporting, it's really a tough reading. So it's a complex issue, and it really involves a number of stakeholders. So what we need, and what I would like to echo Helena in, is that we need the whole government approach. You really need to coordinate and collaborate across government. We're now in the midst of a so-called taxonomy mapping exercise in the Czech Republic. So what we did, we created this master Excel that puts together all these criteria, and we are about to bomb the administration with it, sending it out and saying, guys, come forward, who's responsible for this, who's responsible for that. We walk through all these criteria, look, because they always refer to some just please stop me if I'm over time. I'm gonna keep talking. It's work that I really like. We went through all these criteria, which always refer, or sometimes refer, in many cases refer to different regulations, different directives. And we looked at who's responsible for the regulation or our respective directive on a national level. And we put together a draft Excel that really distributes the ownership of different elements of the taxonomy across the whole government. And it's a really huge exercise where only the instruction how to approach filling in the Excel, it's 2 A4s. So we're gonna give a month to the departments to look at it and see what we can come back. But this should, in the end, work like a publicly accessible document where all the stakeholders can quickly find out who's responsible for interpretation of different sustainability criteria, which are not always easy to interpret. So that's it? Okay.
Okay. So I would like to think about how to to change the understanding of a compliance check exercise versus an opportunity through the all sustainable finance agenda, because at the end of the day should be seen as an opportunity for us. Therefore, how what can the platform do to support the market participants to understand these opportunities, not to be seen as a headache, as a very complex and difficult, hundreds of Excel files and criteria, but to be seen as an opportunity for the business.
Thank you. And thank you, Ota, because you have upgraded. Thank you, Ota, because you have upgraded the taxonomy from dictionary to encyclopedia. So you already made me very happy. So let me first respond to Ota by saying, when I was, that was not many decades ago, but some decades ago, when I was studying in high school, and I was studying, I took IT, right? I took IT as an optional subject. And you know what I studied for 2 years? I studied Pascal, programming, Pascal and BASIC. I mean, how many students today are they taught programming in high school? None. What are they taught? How to use a computer, right? And what are they given? The Microsoft Office package. So that's exactly what the platform is trying to do. We're trying to develop the Microsoft Office package because, let me tell you, you Ota might need to learn the entire taxonomy, but the majority, the rest of the Europeans don't need to. All they need to understand is how it works. And all they need to know is the criteria for the economic activities that they conduct and how it works, the puzzle I just told you, right? And what we need now, I mean, the problem that we have is that we're still programming because we're still developing the taxonomy. We're currently expanding, developing the technical criteria for more activities to include in both the climate and the environmental act. And at the same time, we're implementing it in the round. So the main problem we face is time. The problem is that we don't have time because we have only 26 years to reach to net zero. We have 16 years to reach to 90% of emissions reduction. So unfortunately, we haven't had the luxury to develop all the tools and then hand over to you the Microsoft Office package and say, there you go, and teach you how it works. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. But the Microsoft Office package needs to be developed. And we started with the Taxonomy, Navigator, and Compass that is available on the site, but we're doing much more than that. There are tools on the internet, and programming, very smart people that are coming up with ways of calculating automatically the taxonomy alignment of your portfolios, for example. One of the things that the platform had really lobbied the Commission and really advocated for was for the use of estimates, yeah? Unfortunately, not all the data is out there. We're going to have the data in Europe. I mean, you mentioned about data. We're going to have really detailed, homogenized, standardized data for 50,000 companies in Europe. We're going to have, for the first time, the CapEx alignment, telling us how their financing planning, what the financing planning is, and the CapEx investments of 50,000 companies. But we cannot have it from the rest of the world, right? So we need to allow for those estimates. And what we need is to develop the tools that would allow investors and financiers and banks and others to calculate that automatically. So that is one of the things we're working on. The other thing I already mentioned was the consistency piece, the platform 0.10 in October 2022, we published a report that it was on data and usability, where we listed 64 recommendations on consistency and improvement of data for the European Commission. This platform has already published 3 briefings that has handed over to the Commission on SFDR and ESRS, how to improve consistency and avoid duplicity, and make it much more effective. And we're working on a final report that will include really simple simplification and review of the criteria, particularly usability of criteria of the taxonomy, but looking specifically to do no significant harm. One of the things that we have now in Europe is that you have the do no significant harm for the public sector and the do no significant harm for the private. But we recognize in that these two need to start, coming together, because you cannot have a skew market. You cannot ask a company to, to comply with these standards, and then when it comes to procurement, to comply with lower standards. We need to work towards that, and that's what we're working. I don't want to bore you, but we are reviewing for the geeks in the room, Article 8 Delegated Act. I question the validity, personally, of OPEX. The GAR, the green asset ratio for banks, needs to be simplified. We recognize that. We need an approach, a specific approach, with the principle of proportionality being at the very core for small, medium, and enterprises. We're working on the data, because until now, we have very much focused on the data coming from private sector, right? Companies and so forth. But there's other set of data. That's the data, the environmental data, that is spread around Europe, that is owned by public authorities, municipalities, regions, national. And believe me, it's not standardized at all. It's not, centralized, and it's not available to financial institutions that they need that, and companies, in order to implement some of the criteria, maybe of the taxonomy, but also, for example, on adaptation, to know the extent to which they need to adapt their facilities and their installations. So we're working with we launched a pilot project with the European Environmental Agency that is going to look at the data that's available, how we can start making it accessible and standardized for financial institutions. And I could go on, because the list is very long, but the point I want to share is that, we're very much aware of many, I don't know if all the challenges, but many of the challenges. We're working on that, but now what we need from the Commission and the European authorities is the right resources to put it in place, because we need those resources to develop the tools, everything I just mentioned, but also we need, very importantly, capacity building, and we need to support, member states and all the different actors in the different member states to implement, to then train, and to develop their own tools as well.
I am very focused on the clock that it's ticking over there. So I would like to open the floor and to take 1 2 questions from the floor to our distinguished speakers. So please, the floor is over. Over to you.
You can also put questions via Slido.
Please, Eva.
Thank you. Helena Ota, probably a question. How to upskill in a magical, fast way the government, officials, and any types of stakeholders outside of the private sector?
I'll start. Thank you for the question. Very good question. It also links us to the end of your previous contribution. It's important that we actually internally within the public administrations create capacities that you would be willing to upskill. As for now, I think that I can be talking only for the region of Central Eastern Europe, but I feel that we have a severe delay in terms of adopting the public administrations to the sustainable finance agenda and framework. Some of this regulation that you mentioned, they were negotiated in 2018-19. They come from 2020-21, and we're currently in 2024, and it now gets traction within the public sphere debate back home that we would really need to start building the capacities internally, and not only at the Ministry of Finance, but also across the whole government. What we did is within the TSI, the Technical Support Instrument project that we are now running with the European Commission, One of these, it has 6 deliverables from a good practice report, diagnostic report, public policy options, but one important pillar is awareness building. And we have done already 5 or 6 workshops where we invited people first from the Ministry of Finance. I remember when we were talking about this event in spring when we were planning with the team and the Commission how much people would come, and I wanted a room for at least 50 people, and people were like, nobody's gonna come. And we got only 60 people out of the Ministry of Finance. Then we did through another one for the whole public administration. We got around 80 people from different departments. Then we did another one for the private sector. So I think this has to be a continuous effort and gradual bringing the progress or the newly established regulation in Brussels through the public administration, through the core team of the Ministry of Finance to other parts of the public administration, and making sure that the ministers are aware of the fact that they will need additional people to work on this topic, because it's a really it's a paradigm shift. It's really a different way how the financial markets will work, and we can't do it with the current capacities. It's not to say the thing that ministries can reshuffle, from one agenda to other and strengthen these agendas. But as I said, the mapping of the taxonomy across the administration sends a clear message that it's not only Ministry of Finance work, it touches 8 or 9 different structural departments that will work on interpreting and managing these criteria within public administration, because you really need substance people on this.
Thank you, Ota. I will take a question from the silo. So I think, Elena, it's for you. What about, which are the plans? Is the social taxonomy still on the roadmap or not? So we talk about the 6 environmental objectives, but what about the social part?
So before I answer that, very, very quick on the last point, if I may, the building blocks or the main pieces of the jigsaw have been developed, yeah? We need to refine them, consistency, but have been developed. So I think that for the next Commission, I think the #1 goal should be the implementation and the supporting and the capacity building, yeah? I'm going to leave it there. So in terms of the social taxonomy, well, as you know, Platform, as we call it 1.0, developed a methodology with the building blocks of what could be a social taxonomy. Now, the Commission did not, move it forward. I think personally very wisely, because already we started hearing the voices that were saying this is too complex, how we're going to put this in, implement, so forth. And there's a decision to say, let's first develop the green taxonomy, the environmental taxonomy. Let's make sure it works. Let's learn from that exercise, and then maybe then we can move into the social. Having said that, I want to say 2 things. The first is that the entire sustainable finance framework includes minimum safeguards. Those are social with a few governance aspects that are across the board, so that the social impact is taken into account. Number 2, on transition plan and transition planning, the just transition and the social angle is hugely important, and the platform is taking that very seriously and is working on a report on transition plans that we will publish after the summer, and just transition, as I said, its core. And last but not least, climate change, it is first and foremost a social issue, because climate change is a multiplier of all the social problems we face. So when we deal with climate change first and foremost, it's for a reason. And the reason is because it's a multiplier. What we need to understand and include in this, let's call it first round, is the interlink and the interconnection with other environmental objectives and with the social angle. And I think that if we do that, we will be doing a great, social benefit to Europe in this case.
Thank you. And because I represent EIB, and I will say in short, EU Climate Bank, EU Climate and Environmental Sustainability Bank. I will take another question about investment outside of EU. So how do we align, how we transfer the knowledge, and how to consider taxonomy alignment and the whole sustainable finance agenda outside of EU when we invest outside?
Okay. I'll start by saying that the EU taxonomy, this dictionary now upgraded to encyclopedia, has had a huge impact externally, because now we can count off on almost 40 taxonomies that have been developed or are in the making, yeah? So it just proves the extent to which the taxonomy is a tool that is being seen as super important and the core of any sustainable finance framework, yeah? Not least because, and I think we haven't touched upon that, not least because for the very first time, when we started developing the taxonomy in Europe, we moved from the high-level discussions, right, on net zero, yes, we want to reach by 2050, and really had to say sectorial, but very high-level discussions, we descended to the ground of what does it really mean to reach 2050, for each one of the economic activities at that level of detail. And the very fact that, yes, the taxonomy might not be perfect, but it has been approved. What is this dictionary? This encyclopedia has been approved by the Parliament, by the 27 countries, and now we have, a direction of travel. This taxonomy has to be different in different countries by nature, because when you look, for example, the taxonomy in Rwanda is very much focused on adaptation, because that's the main, environmental issue that they face. In Brazil, biodiversity, surprise, surprise, and ecosystems is hugely important. So what we need, and this is what the Commission is working together with other countries through the international platform Sustainable Finance, is to share the structure of substantial contribution, do no significant harm, and to share the environmental metrics. Where do you set the threshold has to be a reflection of your economy, but we need to, like we've done for finance, we all have the same, more or less, meaning or definition for revenues, right? Or CapEx. So we need the same when it comes to environmental indicators, and then each country should set the bar where they are, yeah? But in terms of the interoperability of the wider, framework, not moving away from the taxonomy, what the Commission has really worked and made an effort through EFRAG is to make the ESRS, the reporting standards, compatible with the ISSB, the international standard. And that's what it needs to be. The same for other reasons. It needs to be compatible, so we ensure interoperability, but they don't need to be the same. I think that it is good to have Europe or other regions, moving forward, being more competitive, and then creating that race to the top. What we need is compatibility, not necessarily the same framework.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Ota, and a big thank you to you for engaging.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adina, for leading the interview, Helena and Ota for participating. And now it's time to shift our focus on what approaches, changes, and financial needs are essential for a successful transition. Let's explore this topic with our next panel's host, Ms. Linda Zelina, and their guests.
Okay, everybody, so we are running out of time, so our panel is just as delayed as the European transition. So excuse that. I would like my fellow panelists, please take your seats. And let's thank Helena, who has to now travel back. I have to say that Helena is the first senior platform member who traveled to the region. So woohoo, first time in Bratislava. So thank you very much. And now let's shift gears and actually discuss what does this mean in practice. And I hope that Otta is staying in the room and not blocking the camera, just like I did earlier. Yeah, and let's also thank Otta actually for a lot of leadership in that space, because when the department was created, we were shocked. Just like we were shocked that our center survived, then the next miracle happened, and we were like, this is happening. We're finally seeing some progress. So now let's dig deeper in terms of what does that progress mean for private sector, for finance? Are we making sufficient progress? Why do people care? Of course, we being in this space are very excited, but guess what? This space also is seeing a lot more traditional actors joining. So I'd actually like to start with Maximilian, please. So if you'd like to quickly introduce yourself, I think that will work best. And also tell us maybe a little bit more about why the private investors are starting to care about sustainability space, please.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Maximilian Kufer. You can call me Max. I'm here to talk a little bit about the private investment space. Why should we care now? What's happening? So if I'm going to just set the tone a little bit, there's a couple things that I wanted to make sure we get across. I'll keep it light, because I know a lot of this can be very theoretical. But I think what we should all take away is the why now, how, and when we should be really doing this. So climate change is often defined as the challenge of a generation. The concept of net zero, it's something that we speak about. We see that, but in something which is so critical, so important, it's sometimes the one concept that is the most difficult to really truly comprehend. What does it mean if we don't meet these net zero by 2050 objectives? What actually happens if we're living in a 2-degree warmer world, 3 degrees, 4 degrees? It is those very questions that sometimes we need to make sure that we're asking ourselves, that we really grasp, why should we be acting now? Now, we've all stayed in hotels before. We see that when it's a little bit cold, you want to maybe adjust 1 degree. That seems fine. But really those global impacts are where we start to see those small micro changes that have a lasting effect. What that does to our agriculture, water supply, production, city stress, well-being, comfort. All these domino effects start to come into play if we don't start to consider the long-term impacts of climate change. So with that in mind, we all have a role to play. So we've all talked about the numbers that are out there. If we think about energy transition alone, it's estimated that the investment gap is approximately $194 trillion to meet those objectives. Now, that number may seem incomprehensible, it may seem intangible, but again, the roles that we have to play is so critical. If we think about 2022 alone, the amount of insured losses is estimated to have exceeded $140 billion. And that's the 5th year since 2017 where those insured losses from natural catastrophe events have exceeded 100 billion. So it is something that we can see that's happening. So to just wrap up a couple thoughts here, I think why we should be taking an interest is that, first of all, we all have a role to play. There's public capital, private capital. There's the provision of investment opportunities, funds, and products like investment managers like Invesco that we can bring to market. Again, supporting the ability to access those investment opportunities, to access transition funds and strategies to support the overall transition to a low-carbon economy. So I'll leave it at that as just a bit of a segue into why we should start considering this now and the role that we all can take part in.
Thank you very much. That's perfect. I think it's quite interesting to think about the risk, because we kind of think that, oh, well, our children will deal with it, grandchildren will deal with it. But what we're seeing that some of these risks are starting to materialize even in our lifetime. And then what sections of society and what businesses it affects and how is a big question. Talking about the business readiness to absorb this shock and deal with the risk and also exploit any kind of potential new markets, etc. I'd like to turn to you, Eva, since you represent a bank that has international operations, and Eva has done a lot of leadership in the banking space, trying to move the Czech Banking Association to do a lot more, etc. So it'd be very interesting to hear, how do you see the Slovakia and the Czech Republic in comparison to its peers? And are you seeing any kind of developments, positive signs, etc., that the private sector, and especially business side, is waking up to this new topic.
Thanks a lot. Very happy to be here today. Thank you all. My name is Eva Bučová, and I'm chairing Sustainability Committee in ING Czech Republic. And I am very fortunate that at the same time, I'm double-hatting also a commercial position, being head of coverage. Why am I saying I'm fortunate? Because for me, sustainability at this particular point in time, particularly in Central Eastern Europe, is in the face of theory. And largely in the face of theory. We have some part of leadership, which is coming from particularly from the private sector. And that leadership usually comes from either international corporates who have their parent companies really imposing quite a pressure to really implement a sustainability strategy which was defined globally. They have vast experience with implementing sustainable projects, issuing sustainable instruments, tapping the capital market. So they can really share experience and make the implementation relatively straightforward for the local subsidiaries. But then we also have, and I'm very happy to see that we have more and more of them, the local corporates or corporates who were established in Czech, Slovak republics and who expanded already beyond the horizon, not just of Czech and Slovak republics, but also Europe, and who are actually also partially driving the change already, either by introducing a sustainable product or a range of sustainable products or sustainable projects. So lucky enough, we have both universes. However, I believe the pace is relatively hesitant. And I think all the banks would agree with me that we are really, really hungrily waiting for the period when we can say we have the corporates piled up in front of the doors, looking and waiting for the green loans to be taken. And the reason is that indeed there is a lot of theory now coming in. We need to learn the encyclopedia, we need to understand the encyclopedia, and next to that we simply find also instruments and ways how to report on it. And effectively what we are seeing that those corporates who started already a number of years ago now are stopping by and really trying to see whether all these activities which they considered in the past sustainable are really sustainable based on the new taxonomy. And the corporates who were not engaged yet, they are still waiting for their time to come. And I would like to really echo, there is no time. And this is what we are trying to explain to our corporates, and this is the role we can play, and that's why I'm saying lucky that I am in sustainability and business, because the sustainability implementation goes not just for us as banks, because we also need to be the leaders in decarbonizing ourselves and trying to see how we can actually drive or have leadership in sustainability, but also liaising with our clients. Our clients and the loans we are providing to the clients are actually creating our portfolio, which we need to decarbonize. And with our need to decarbonize, they need to decarbonize. And we need to find a very good ways how to explain to our corporates that this is very much needed, not just for us, but for them as well. And why for them? And this is what I find very exciting when speaking with clients. First, we have divided up the clients into sectors, because we believe that every sector has different dynamics, different emission intensity, different net zero pathway, and we simply need to be very thoughtful that every sector really will have its own way how to decarbonize across the entire value chain. And this is how ING actually introduced the project Terra, which is the first, or the approach Terra, which is the first approach which is being transparently posted on the market, and at the same time helps companies to actually find a way how to decarbonize, because for every sector we have specific decarbonization pathway. For example, we have published steel principles, or we are now working on aluminium decarbonization. So we are trying to focus on specific parts of the value chain where the emission intensity is the highest. And you might now ask, okay, so how do we compare with peers? Obviously, these are just corporates, these are just banks, so each of us is playing its role. We are all pushing quite a lot on other stakeholders. OTA is very well aware of that. so that we are not just reactive, but we are proactive. And that's why I very much appreciate what Helena said. Come to us and share with us. What are your issues? And this is what I believe needs to be done much more. And sharing of all the obstacles we are seeing between all stakeholders, because we either take it all or not. Each of us can do a lot, but each of us can do only as much. And then we really need a cooperation. And this is what actually our sustainability strategy and approach is about, really putting all stakeholders at one table and trying to find a way how to approach it. And this is still not happening sufficiently. There are countries where it is happening more. There are countries where also infrastructure investments are being pursued much more, and I think this is the part which is missing very heavily in Czech Republic and Slovakia, and where we need to pick up big time.
Thank you. I think it's a strong message about the fact that we have a lot of educational work to do, which is natural, right? People argue that they worked on sustainability for decades, but in reality, for the market, it's a new topic. And actually interesting that you mentioned Helena's point, come to us. When we actually looked at the statistics of the CE region's submissions to any consultation process under the Sustainable Finance Framework, we're doing appallingly badly. In some cases, there's not even a single submission from an entire country. So this is a really big issue. This shows that either people lack the know-how, they don't care, or there's something else happening, but we need to fix that. Because that means that then your concerns, your voice is not heard. So if you want to be heard and are struggling, please come to us, we can help you. Anyway, let's now turn to James before I introduce Olivier. So James, you're coming from Green Finance Institute, which is another think tank, partially do tank, and you've done some amazing things on decarbonization. So my question would be, we talk about a transition in this region a lot. It's a major issue, right? We have different structure of the capital market, different needs, very industrial countries. So what are the kind of most powerful transition financing tools that we can use, and what's been happening with transition and transition finance, how it can be used? Do we need to strive for perfection, or is there a solid way to start, and what's the international experience on that?
Thanks, Linda, and thanks for having me here, and David, thank you for the invite. I think one of the mantras that we would say is don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So we don't need to find perfect solutions, but we do need to find solutions now. We definitely need to move into implementation. I think regulation and transition plans and transparency and understanding what gets measured, gets managed is very important, but we need actually to start moving money in the real economy now. And what we try to do at the Green Finance Institute is to define what the business case is for that transition and look to financial innovation mechanisms to aid that, to make it a commercial venture as much as a decarbonisation sort of planet-saving venture, if I can put it that way. And so, for me, what we like to see is, if you look at how the transition has gone, some of the sort of the low-hanging fruit now is very commercial in terms already. You're seeing sort of wind and solar and these sorts of technologies that are at commercial rates, but they weren't originally at commercial rates. And I think what we've seen in the past is where public capital has been deployed in the most efficient ways. So back a number of years ago in the UK, a contracts for difference process was put in place, which gave buyers of wind energy a revenue certainty type mechanism. And we're seeing that now. The EIB announced in December last year counter guarantees up to €5 billion that is enabling commercial banks to go beyond what their current balance sheets are, limiting them to do to allow to take on more development of wind farms at a commercial level. And this is exactly what we need. And the 5 billion is a headline number, and some people think that is potentially expensive to the public purse and therefore inflationary. But if you look at analysis by the International Chamber of Commerce, for instance, that looked at where counter guarantees were called in 2016 to 2020, it was 0.2% of those guarantees were actually called in. So that's what 10 million euros of the 5 billion would be spent over that 4 to 5 year period. I think these are some of the things that we need to look at. If you look at what's happening in Germany, 900 million euros, if we kind of move from wind into sort of maybe some of the more advanced sectors, hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel. There are things happening now in Germany under H2 Global's a 900 million euro auction where they actually had the double-sided auction. They sat between both the sellers of hydrogen and the buyers. And so they went out to the market and said, okay, what can you sell hydrogen at? What can you sell us eSAF at? And the prices came in way up here because it's expensive to produce this at the moment. And then they turned around to the buyers and said, okay, well, we've got a price for the sellers. What can you buy it at? And of course, they came in down here. And so what the German government have done is they said, well, we'll bridge that gap because we need to create this market. This market needs to be created. And that is very efficient use of capital because the market gets created. You've got 10-year revenue certainty for the sellers, and they're doing 1-year revenue certainty on the buy side. But that creates that market, which then drives down the price of sustainable aviation fuel and enables the mandates that are coming in now to be reached. So this efficient public capital deployment is, I think, where we need to get to.
Thank you. I mean, that's a very good point. How do we use the public money a little bit better to actually achieve those climate neutrality goals? Because we have a lot of money. If you look at EU emissions trading scheme point 2, we will have up to potentially 1 trillion to spend. And the current misspending of the current EU ETS is a different discussion, but essentially there's a lot of improvement that what we could do to actually align it with the outcomes that we're seeking rather than going against them. Let me bring in Olivier and also remind the audience that we do have the Slido, but since it's not a huge room, if you'd like to ask a question, please go ahead. We would like this to be quite interactive. So I'm sure there's a super difficult question that you're sitting on and just dying to ask, so please feel free. And also, if you don't feel comfortable, bring it to the room with the wine. Olivier, so you represent CAN Network, and you did a very interesting report that looked also what could be the potential economic benefits of the climate transition. It actually spoke about this region and about Slovakia in particular. So could you share some of the insights in terms of what are these benefits or potentially risk mitigation things for climate action, spending on climate, and what are the weak points of the current EU funding and what could be done better, just to continue the discussion that James started, that, let's do something more, and then we can grill Otta later over wine about the topic.
So in terms of your first question, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation as well. It's a great pleasure to be here, and my first time in Slovakia, so that was great.
That's the second participant speaker who's like, first time in Slovakia, it's very nice, there we go.
Exactly. So yes, in terms of your first question, the report we published was basically a response to a kind of narrative that has taken over completely the political debate in several EU member states, according to which everybody is seeing only cost to the transition, right? So, whenever you speak right now to policymakers, a lot of business leaders and so on, it's about cost, investment cost, energy system cost, etc. There is also a lot of populism, by the way, exploited by certain political groups on that. So our idea with this report is to actually collate all the existing evidence around the benefits of climate action, not at EU level, only at EU level, because at EU level we have quite good data. What we noticed that was missing was essentially the benefits at national level in respective member states through a systematic methodology. So we started that based on our Paris Agreement compatible scenario model, which is actually a more accelerated scenario pathway compared to the current pathway of the EU, which is not aligned with 1.5 degrees, unfortunately. And basically then looks at two things. One, of course, the avoided climate change losses, right, implied by... and secondly, that's another thing we don't speak about, the so-called co-benefits of climate action. And the co-benefits of climate action include things like, avoided fossil fuel imports that, were mentioned earlier in the keynote speech. They include things like positive health impacts. I don't know if you know that, but the OECD calculates that for Slovakia in particular, the premature mortality and morbidity associated with air pollution, right, is equivalent, if you put it in monetized terms, to about 7% of GDP every year. right? So this is non-market valuation, it's not actual production, but it gives you a sense of the problem. So of course, if you can avoid the losses, this is a benefit. It also includes things like, avoided material resource use as a consequence of more efficiency and reduction of energy demand, and so on and so forth. So we put all these things together and we actually compare them, to the additional costs implied by the transition, both investment costs and energy system costs. And, the benefit cost ratio you end up with is something like 4:1. So for Slovakia in particular, the benefits, just the co-benefits, so not the avoided losses, if you want to put it in equivalent terms to kind of understand the scale, it was about 11% of 2022 GDP, right? So not insignificant. So that was the purpose of the report. On the second part of your question, which is more on EU funds, so that's a different, quite different topic. Let me start by saying that all existing evidence suggests that, about perhaps 50% of the total investment needs that, were mentioned earlier are not bankable, right? And, this is based on the an EIB study, it's based on a few consultancies that have done, several studies on, the EU emissions pathway to 2050, the European Commission and so on. Maybe it's 40, maybe it's 60, but it's a substantial part, of those transition needs. And the reason why EU funds are so important is very simply because despite the fact that, the EU budget is only about 1%, of European GDP, so nothing big. It's a bit larger now with Next Generation EU. Actually, in terms of the proportion of public investment it represents in poorer member states, including CE region and Southern European countries, so, the periphery, EU funds represent, in most cases, more than 50% of public investments in those countries. In some cases, it reaches up to 80–85%. So how these funds are used is absolutely a central question in terms of whether these and to what extent these investments are mobilized to fill the public investment needs of the transition. Now, just taking two of the largest funds of the EU, right, which are essentially the cohesion policy funds and the post-pandemic recovery and resilience facility, right, which represent actually, more or less half of the EU budget for the current budget cycle, so a lot of money. Essentially, member states needed, to submit, spending plans for each one of those. And what the EU did was to essentially increase the so-called climate mainstreaming target for cohesion policy in the current budget cycle. So it means that 30% of these spending plans need to be dedicated to climate-related investments. And for the recovery and resilience facility, that percentage is 37%, right? So this is the minimum legal threshold. And then it introduces a second concept based on the taxonomy, which is the do no significant harm concept. So it says not only you need to align a proportion of your expenditures with climate-related investment, dedicate part of those expenditures there, but also the entirety of your recovery and resilience plan, so all the other measures that have nothing to do necessarily with climate shouldn't harm any of the environmental objectives, including climate, biodiversity, circular economy, pollution control, etc., etc. So these were the two major innovations introduced, but, this is a minimum threshold. I mean, member states see that as a checklist. Very often, unfortunately, they shouldn't. But, this was, if you want, the overall framework in which the spending plans were designed by respective governments. Unfortunately, I would say that, there are a few negative things that remained in the current EU budget cycle. We didn't manage to completely kick out fossil fuel investments, right? So in the 2014-2020 budget, there were still, coal and oil investments were still eligible to a large extent. These were kicked out. But gas investments remained, particularly gas distribution networks and gas boilers. And, you know, a key lesson I think we need to draw is that when we're speaking about mobilizing finance to meet climate targets, is that, you know, the very first thing we need to do is to stop subsidizing harmful investments, right? Especially when we're talking about public finance. And unfortunately, the current, you know, EU budget rules still allow, you know, that loophole, and unfortunately, a lot of member states exploited that.
Thank you. That's a very, very strong point, because often people go, well, why bother? And I think that the question that we have from Slido is directly related, right? What are the incentives to private companies to transition to net zero? Like, why would you spend money? So what's the upside? There's no enabling framework there, in the sense that you all of a sudden don't get cheaper loans. And we're going to turn to Eva next, talking about what can banks do and what's the role there, because a lot of the financing in the region happens through banks. But it's a very interesting question, because I think that the example that you gave of how the Recovery and Resilience Fund actually then had the DNSH criteria applied is a very interesting thing. Because initially, the EU taxonomy and the whole sustainable finance framework, the only agreement that we could get at EU level that could go through was very technical. So you had the taxonomy, you had SFDR, so the one for private financial institutions, that was the first files to go through. Then you had CSRD after. So the puzzles that Helena mentioned weren't sequenced in the right order. So now we're scrambling backwards. But the point is now all the pieces are there, and now it's time to make sense of it. And I think that that's what we're going to see, a lot of speeding up once people have the know-how, etc. And that's also why this current platform's mandate is so much on usability. So actually, to influence what's going to happen under next commission, this is the time. So really, you need to start engaging. And on that note, there will be also an announcement. There is a big event in Brussels on 22nd of April, which is hosted by the platform and the EU Commission, doing a deep dive into each of these sections, like, you know, sustainable finance and banking, etc., etc. So you can also interact there. But Eva, I'll give that question to you, and then to you, Maximilian, also to talk about how does private equity and how does investment side look at it. But let's start with you, Eva, if you have any good examples of why you should care, and then we move on to Maximilian.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably I start with a macro view. There have been more than 200 signatories to Paris Agreement. Czech Republic, Slovakia are also one of those. So there is no doubt all of us are on one ship, and if we will be actually swimming, we will be swimming, and if we will be sinking, we will be sinking. All together, just one of us will not make all of us dance. Yeah, that doesn't work. So from that perspective, there should be a level of intrinsic motivation. I am part of the story, just like anybody else. Then, of course, the question might come, okay, why now? I will wait for the others because that's precisely what we are seeing, and I will wait until somebody or something pushes me. So what we are trying to actually see with our clients is to see and to realize whether they are already pushed by any part of the either supply chain or off-takers to actually behave more responsibly. And guess what? More than 90% of our clients already feel a push from certain side. First, they are either part of a supply chain and there are ESG criteria put on them going forward. And the moment they are not fulfilling the criteria, then they will not provide actually their goods to their off-takers. Or the other way around, that the off-takers say that actually I want only green products from you by 2026. And you have now 2 years to actually invest and to do things much more differently and responsibly. For example, in the steel sector, it's very obvious. As of 2026, which is in a 2 years' time, most of the off-takers will only accept green steel. Is it possible to actually change the status quo within 2 years? Actually, it's not so easy, but suddenly the corporates are put into the position that they have to actually make it work in a very short period of time. They had 15 years up until now, and nobody moved the needle, or many of them didn't. Now they are in a situation when the investment is actually very expensive. The investments into sustainable solutions went up more than 10 times when it comes to the price in average, in some cases less, in some cases more. Next to that, so they have definitely increased cost. There is scarcity, so they have to wait for the technologies to be produced much longer. There is scarcity also in people who are installing those technologies because they will be deployed by many other peers or parts of the supply chain. And next to that, obviously, many of the companies, let's look into steel because that's very, I think, incumbent for Czech Republic as well as in Slovakia, where the transition needs to be made. You need to change a complete business model. It's not that just you just change the furnace into an electric one. Only this itself costs 500 million euros. That's a huge investment for a private company. And next to that, they have to change the entire way how they are working. So it's no longer that they buy actually a material. They have to actually collect scrap. They have to collect scrap from the entire region, from actually the distance which works still. They have to make sure that there is enough scrap to actually burn into electric furnace. And next to that, they also have to make sure that they will be able to produce the same or very similar quality of steel, which is not easy as well. So they are on one hand facing a number of challenges which are increasing cost. So they need to buy property because they need to collect the scrap somewhere. They need to actually take care of the logistics, and they also need to effectively employ much more people. So that's one thing. And second thing, at the same time, it brings a lot of positives that electric furnace you can switch out and switch off anytime when the price doesn't work. That is something that's a model that didn't work in the industry before at all. So it is saving your cost tremendously because you don't need to sell your steel for less money than you want. So from that perspective, but this was figured out only during the process. This was actually not a known benefit before. So you really need to go into that with the clients and try to really figure out and find the pluses in that. So what is your motivation? First, because you might miss the train. That's one thing. And other clients will actually start producing the same and will replace you. The second thing obviously can be a financial advantage, but that should not be a major motivation. Your banks can actually incentivize you via KPI-linked scenarios, KPI-linked loans, where you actually agree to certain ESG KPIs. You can actually get a financial advantage. It's not enormous, it's not huge, but you can get it effectively every year if you align with that. But you can be also penalized. Let's be aware of that. If you don't deliver your commitments, then you might be penalized. When you decide to tap the capital markets, on the capital markets, you find new investors, so you can expand your investor base, and actually you will expand your investor base. That's a fact. Whether you will achieve a lower price really depends at the timing you enter the market and actually the way how you approach your green bond issuance. So that's a financial advantage. And the third one, all of us will need to decarbonize, and the banks will need to decarbonize, and they have very ambitious global policies and global aspirations as to how quickly they will decarbonize. And at some point, you might realize that you will not be anymore a client who can be actually covered by that bank for a certain period of time. So and it's in the interest of all of us bankers to actually keep you as part of our clients and client portfolio for long. And that's why we are trying to help you to set up your transition plan. And part of the reporting lines actually under all the regulations which are coming in are also client transition plans. And for example, ING as such is the first one who piloted as a bank globally that we are going to collect information about our client transition plans, which we did last year. And these client transition plans need to be taken away actually and taken on board by the relationship managers. And we are investing a lot of money, time and effort to upskill every relationship manager to be not just knowing the financial products and knowing their clients, but also knowing their sectors and knowing their sustainability pathways in the sectors. So it's a huge change in the mentality and setup. The relationship manager is there on the phone with the client, standing next to him and trying to really advise him on the steps that need to be taken. And the good benefit for all us international banks is that we see the global markets, we see various markets where his peers are active in, and we can actually provide some level of inspiration as well as some level of knowledge how the other peers in the sector have done it. So we are trying to actually serve that purpose. So that's on my end.
Thank you. I mean, it's quite interesting because often you see, I have a lot of meetings in Brussels because we're part of the platform, and I meet a lot of industry associations, so CEOs of industry associations, and the amount of moaning that I get about this region is, it's very surprising. And it's mainly about the fact that nobody's thinking about transition plans. And for them, then it's very difficult to advocate on the Brussels level because the companies in this region are not necessarily engaging and they don't really want to invest in the transition planning, and that means that, you know, they can't actually argue towards the Commission that we're doing something because the Commission goes, meh, not doing anything here. So it's actually a very interesting case of how it's also affecting the Brussels policy debates. So let me turn to you, Maximilian. Eva actually already linked slightly that you can really get more investors, you can, you know, get more money. Is that true? And what does now the investor side need, and how can you help? What's your role?
Well, what I will say is, you know, there is an increased interest and opportunity in the space. If you look at, you know, the back end of COP28 in Dubai in December, it was very clear that the gap and the necessity to support hard-to-abate sectors, regions across the globe that are at risk, that is very clear and that is underserved. And there's also a question of where the funding comes from, this debate of public financing, private, you know, there's all sorts of stakeholders at play here. The example that I like to actually refer to is a bit of a global example. If you think to the US, with the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, here is a significantly large mandate to support transition across all sectors, the built environment, construction, energy. And I think that's a prime example of where you can see something which is a collaboration where all stakeholders can benefit. Now, when it comes to the investment management side of things, you know, where do we see that opportunity? I think showcasing the efforts that we're making to support financing towards these initiatives, the creation of funds and products that can identify those gaps, that can identify the investment opportunity as a diversification strategy, that's something which is very real. I think that investors are starting to recognize if we can demonstrate the forward-looking approach in the way that we're considering risk or value preservation or enhancing value in the long term for our end clients, that's something which I think has a lasting and meaningful impact. So it's really that forward-looking notion that we want to make sure that we're demonstrating, providing the opportunities, the access to capital, but more specifically, access to those solutions that may not be possible in some instances.
Thank you. I think it's interesting also to think that in investing, of course, what you're seeking is you're not an impact investor in most cases. You're actually seeking resilience and return. So that's why we are seeing so many more climate-related funds that are created.
Precisely. If I could just add one last point to this also, just in that very concept of, yes, our duty is to enhance the investment experience for our end clients. If we look at some of the more specific asset classes like real estate, here is a very real, tangible asset class where we can see what is the actual performance of the building today. Does it have any potential risk exposure to flooding, to earthquake, to wildfire? Very possible, depending on where it's sitting. And you can't, unfortunately, pick it up and plot it somewhere else. So again, focusing on how do we ensure that we can maintain the liquidity of our asset in the long term, manage that risk, be smart with the allocation of capital, to have targeted business plans, again, to enhance performance, reduce that risk, that is absolutely critical in the role that we can play in this space that we have.
Thank you. And it's also important to remember that most of the people who own capital sit in Western Europe. So they're part of a completely different conversation that we're not even having here. The household savings and how investment works is very, very different. Thinking even about the biggest sovereign wealth funds, you know, it's very interesting. I also would like to tackle one more question before we do a quick wrap up. So there's a question that Olivia, you wanted to take. It's about investments in Europe that are actually impacted by dependence on natural resources from other parts of the world. So this is critical minerals and dependencies of certain sources, including uranium, etc. So if you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I saw it and I was like, that's a really interesting question, going a bit beyond finance, but I would like to say that there are actually, grosso modo, right now, two visions of the energy transition, right? One vision is very much supply-based, right? Which means that essentially, you know, we replace more or less the current level of energy consumption, you know, with renewable energy. You know, we replace all our cars, you know, with nice electric cars and very schematically, and that's about it. And evidently, this supply-based scenario, right, will require an enormous amount of resources, right, from and so on. And that, of course, puts a lot of pressure on biodiversity. Some of them can be mitigated, you know, through an expansion of circular economy practices, but not completely. The second vision of the energy transition, which is also reflected in some of the Commission strategy document, although it's not considered a central scenario right now, is an energy transition that is very much based essentially on demand reduction. Right, and you know, we at CAN Europe have a model which is very much aligned with that, which actually forecasts a 50% energy demand reduction, which is huge. But in any case, you know, this is a vision, again, to schematically put it with an example. You know, instead of, you know, replacing one-to-one our, you know, individual vehicles, we expand a lot, for example, public transport instead, and that means, you know, a very strong reduction in demand in the transport sector, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, you know, evidently, the second approach would precisely minimize that dependence and the potential, you know, negative knock-on impacts of the transition on other environmental objectives. And I think that, you know, the principle of the taxonomy, the do no significant harm principle, also applies at a macro level. And therefore, we should definitely, you know, go for a transition pathway that minimizes possible, you know, indirect impacts on other environmental objectives. That's the main thing.
Thank you. So now as we're wrapping up, because we started late and now we're finishing late, surprise, surprise, as per usual, I think somebody from the previous session actually had a good point that sometimes this is super complicated, etc. But actually it's quite simple. And I think that that question that somebody asked, how can we sell it to the general public? So I had a recent intervention with one of the TV programs when they were like, explain it as you would explain to your auntie in a small village. She's 66 or maybe 57. And they started giving me all this criteria, and I was like, wow, actually, okay, let's dial back. And the point here is, right, what we're trying to do, and I was born in Latvia, I'm trying to protect where I'm picking my mushrooms. I don't want deforestation because then the mushrooms will disappear. We're also avid pickers of berries. We want the berries not to disappear. So if there's going to be weather fluctuations, strawberries won't exist. That's a national tragedy. So there are very simple ways how I think even from the private sector we can communicate to the general public, because people love food, they love clean air, they actually love nature here, they like clean water, and they like fresh air. So in that sense, let's not complicate. Essentially, the ultimate goal of all of this, right, is to have a livable environment. And I think that sometimes we dig too deep and we forget that. James, so I would like to actually ask you one question. So me coming from Latvia, Slovakia is a big country. Then I moved to the UK and they were like, oh, cute, that small country down south. And I'm like, excuse me? So the point is, there's different competition issues between different countries, right? Because who are we kidding? This is a global competition. Governments compete for business, investment, etc. So number one, can private sector do it alone? So can we actually be leaders as banks in this region going, no, we're actually going to drive this agenda. We're going to put it on the how to compete in this space. What can we do?
I think it's definitely possible. So yes to both those questions. I think from a private market perspective, you see that. You look at the work ING have done with their mortgage portfolio, that is not required by law, but they are doing that to lead the way, to show this is the way forward. You look at the private sector in terms of gatherings, coalitions, GFANs, and others. These are the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. These are unregulated entities. Now, that's a question whether they should be regulated or not, but these are unregulated. This is the private market saying, we see the general direction here, we know where this is headed, and we want to protect. We have, we can go back to we have a fiduciary duty to our clients, and we can see if you're an institutional investor with a 20, 30-year time horizon on your investments, you can see where this is going. The private markets needs to lead the way too. And so I think then that helps narrow the gap, because we see this sort of standoff, I think, between, as you mentioned earlier, between a potential lack of ambitious policy, because the public sector isn't sure where the private sector will step in, and then the private sector saying, well, where are we going? So, come on. But I think that gap is definitely narrowing, and I think countries of any size, definitely, I think, particularly with the amount of public finance there is out here, are able to play in that field. Now, it takes an education, it takes some innovation, it takes help, and I think that's what we're all here for, right? Is to see if we can narrow that gap together, because there are solutions that work in Latvia that will work in the UK, and I want to know about those, and I want to know because we have an operation in Spain. I want to bring that over here, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. Is lead the way. I worry about some of the competition, some of the state aid issues that we see at the moment. Some of the fact, the France and Germany are able to move much faster, clearly, than Latvia can, and frankly, the UK can in some respects. And I'd like to see what the Commission and how that works through in the next election. But I think definitely that gap is narrowing, and I think the answer is yes.
Thank you. So there you go. We can leapfrog. There's a question, finally, please, gentleman over there. If we can hand you the microphone.
Hi, my name is Marek Krema. I'm from the Slovak Green Building Council, and I have a question which might be or might sound a bit critical, although it's more, I would say, for like an open question. It's not a critical question in the end. So we talk about topics in a very isolated groups. We talk today in the groups of financial. Then tomorrow we're going to talk about buildings. Then the day after we're going to talk about agriculture. Why do we not sit together? Why there is no round table? That's the first question. The second question is, why do we need EU taxonomy? And instead of that, why do we not transfer the standards in countries in different fields where by standard the questions we talk about today will be fulfilled as a standard by default? And their way, the education would also basically go the way that we would not talk about this as a extra, but there will be a natural thing. My parents learned about climate crisis. My grandmother learned about climate crisis and ozone hole. So there's a new thing? No, it's an old thing. So why do you think we always try to find difficult ways how to adapt and implement instead of just changing the standards? A0 minus 10% for the energy and buildings, great. Why do we not just change it the way that it's A0 minus 10 by default? Why do we talk about fabrics in the buildings with properties like that? Why do we not just change the standards so they'll be not sold like that anymore on the market? Why do we put special standards for materials coming from Asia? Asia, within half a year, they are able to adapt easily. We put standards, we dictate rules, but we ourselves are not an example. So why do you think we always try to find the difficult way how to adapt? That's my question.
It's a great question. I mean, then the question is, do you want the simple answer or the super complicated?
Yes, no.
The simple question, vested interests, big money and lobbying. That would be the very simple answer why some of these things are not simplified in terms of standardization, because, there are people fighting against it, realistically. I think a good question also for CAN Network and everybody else. I mean, it's always been my obsession. Why can't we just have finance, economics, and all the other degrees which have embedded sustainability, right? If we have cross-cutting issues, then this is one that you should have financial literacy and sustainability literacy. it's a question to you. What can we do more to do that? I know in the UK, private business, and this is another thing that here you don't see. There's no market practice of, for example, banks and others working with think tanks or with universities to create new master's degrees or to try and figure out some sort of joint ventures. That does not happen. H2 Green Steel in Sweden was a creation of a multi-stakeholder platform that does not exist here. You try to build it, people are so skeptical that it will take you 5 years to get at least them to trust to come for a coffee. And actually, thanks to NBS and Reiner, we did have a closed door, which was a 360 of different stakeholders. So let's see if we can expand that. But anyway, I'll give floor to James, if anybody else wants to pop in as well.
I'd be interested in that if that H2 Green Steel Coalition was started out looking at steel, because for the answer to your first piece was, it has to be sector specific from a finance perspective because the risks are different. If you look in the built environment perspective, from a GBC, the amount of split incentives there are, either temporal split incentives, people don't renovate their houses because they want to sell them soon, versus landlord-tenant split incentives versus the credit. So finance is all about risk management. And so then you're looking at credit, and so the credit of a person with their home is very different when I'm looking at that versus, or even a commercial real estate organisation and where the building's located, which you can't move. And then if I'm looking at building a sustainable aviation fuel plant and who's going to buy the fuel, airlines, what's their credit rating? Well, post-COVID, not very good. So that's a different conversation. That's a very different thing, which is why you have to, from a financing perspective, you have to break it down like that.
Anyone else last remarks? Or we can take it to the wine room, and then you can have literally all the floor. Olivier?
Thank you.
Something, yeah. No, I think the debate you put as well, I think is the one, prices versus regulation, right? And it's very true that pricing has been the dominant instrument, I think because economics has been dominant over the past 20 years. Regulation, by and large, has a bad name, perceived as inefficient, and so on and so forth, which is not always the case. However, I think, first of all, there are sectors where there is an extremely good case for regulation, and we need to have it, but it still needs to be coupled with finance. And the reason why I say that, and that brings me to an issue we haven't touched on today, which is the social component of the transition. If you start putting standards everywhere, it's very likely that you're going to exclude a lot of people if you don't have financial instruments in parallel, from those markets. So we can say what we want about, every new car will be electric, sold will be electric. There is a lot of people out there who cannot afford it right now. So the question is, what does public finance do in order to ensure that there is a socially just transition, right? Same with building standards. In countries where there is a very large ownership, even of poor households, right? If you start putting very high standards for things they cannot finance because they cannot access bank credit, for example, that would mean they would eventually lose their home. So I think that these two things need to work in parallel. I think there is a very good case for regulation, and it's true that for a very long time we've been shying away from it, but we need to ensure it is designed in a socially just way. And that also means that public finance in particular should predominantly target these social groups. Unfortunately, a lot of the energy efficiency schemes and so on across Europe, and I'll finish with that, for example, and that's just one example, are not well targeted. They're based on a first-come, first-served basis. And usually it's middle-class households that access those funds to renovate their homes, whereas those things could be financed potentially through bank lending. Whereas, in some of the most progressive countries, I would say, these schemes are designed in a way to clearly incentivize and target households that do not have access, to bank credit or to any sort of private finance, or that do not have personal savings to do that. So I think, all these things, should be analyzed on a case-by-case basis in order, to make sure that there are no adverse effects.
Yeah, there's a reason why we do have to keep some sectorality, because if you try to capture everything, then you're a washing machine that, is trying to mop the floor. Eva, would you like to come with the last point, and then we head?
Yeah, only two things. There is one more question and I want to address it. Is there a certain tool which measures the alignment of corporate lending portfolio with climate scenarios? Yes, definitely. There are a number of them, depending whether the lending portfolio is retail or wholesale and which sector it is. But the best start is definitely PACTA tool, so PACTA. That was the starting point for us as well. And this is now freely available for the financial sector. So whether you are insurance or banking or a fund, you can use this methodology.
Created by a think tank.
Yep, exactly. Exactly, and we are using it for our Terra approach as well. So that's one thing. And a second thing, you said it very nicely, that there are S&G elements which need to be really taken into account, and I think that's it pretty much. You mentioned it very well, and I fully agree that it can be made very simple, and that's why I think the role of us banks is to really show to the clients how to implement sustainability across the entire organization, but we can do that as well ourselves. That's why it is not just important that we have net zero commitments, it's also important that we engage our employees in sustainability activities in a way which is not just segmented depending on the part of the bank where are you working in, but it's really across the entire platform, so that every employee understands what sustainability means for his particular job, how he can contribute to the better good, so that he is proud that he is working for this organization, and next to that, what value he can bring to the client. And I think the moment we all understand our role in this, you don't really need the norms and regulations for that.
Thank you. And on that note, we are finishing. So thank you so much for spending your evening listening and asking questions, interacting. Please don't stop asking questions, because now we're moving to the food and drinks room, which is always
We are not.
No, we're not. Do not move.
One last thing before we move, then I invite Rainer Martin to wrap up the session. But Linda, thank you very much, and your fellow panelists for insightful discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. A big thanks to the panelists. A big thank also to the two session chairs. So you managed to make a really rather difficult topic quite accessible. So that's not a small achievement. So I'm not going to summarize this because I stand now between you and food and drink outside. This is a precarious position to be in, so I'll keep it short. Just 3 points I would like to mention, because they were recurrent, and I think they're very, very important. So the first one is that probably after all of these new regulations, the sort of tsunami of regulation that we saw in this field, now maybe the focus should be more on really implementation, on capacity development, on understanding, and on putting things into practice. The second one, also very important, is about balancing expectations, because I think you mentioned that it's in the public debate, it's often all about the risks. Sometimes you also get points of view that it's all a wonderful opportunity and nothing else. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? I mean, there are challenges, but there are also opportunities, and I think it's very important to be honest and to really prescribe that, present this balance in a fair and in an accurate way. And the third one, also very important, is about the use of public funding, because indeed it's scarce. We have quite a lot of it in Europe. Just mentioning again the EIB, but it is still scarce, and I think we need to use this very wisely in order to be able to leverage the private funding that is out there. So last words, two last words. So one, we will probably have a sort of similar event like this in a few months, in June probably, again, hopefully with ISFC. This one will be more about banking regulation, but I think it will be, if you're interested in this topic here, I think you will also be interested in this next event. And then very final words, so big thanks again to the two co-organizers, the British Embassy and ISFC. Thank you very much for your generous support. And of course, to the colleagues in the NBS, big thanks to Roman, big thanks to Jan, and to Maria, and to Vicky, and to our IT team. Otherwise, this would not have worked. And on that, I invite you to join me at the buffet. Thank you very much indeed.